So in our planning for kind of how to do thematic organization, we're actually jumping around a bit, so we apologize for that. We're next going to move to page 63, which is actually in section B, which is a jump from where we were with J. Allen Smith's piece. And this is to begin a very brief, as I said, it's a kind of a quick and dirty historical dive. It's a very brief exploration of the forces of colonialism. Not simply to make you feel any worse, but to say this is one of the driving forces behind the expansion of English common law and the influence of European colonial power over the globe. This is, I don't know if anybody grew up Catholic, this is the papal bull of May 4th, 1493. You'll recognize the date as pretty close to one of those famous historical dates. This is from Pope Alexander VI. And we include this simply to say this was a mindset that said, here is the world in front of us, and here is who has power over it, and who gets to decide. And so it's long. I'm not going to read the whole thing, because I want to leave you to do you can use this for beach reading this summer, because it's kind of an escapist piece. So I'm actually going to quote a couple of places starting on page 64. The first couple of paragraphs are background. The actual text of the letter from the Pope, the papal bull, begins on page 64 under English translation. What I love is his title, not just Alexander Pope, but Alexander Bishop, servant of the servants of God, to the illustrious sovereigns, our very dear son in Christ, Ferdinand King, and our very dear daughter in Christ, Isabella, Queen of Castile, Leon, Aragon, Sicily, and Granada, health and apostolic benediction. Among other works well pleasing to the divine majesty and cherished of our heart, this assuredly ranks highest, that in our times especially the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, and the health of souls be cared for. Who could argue with that? Finish the sentence. And that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. And so this essentially is the Pope in Rome writing to Ferdinand and Isabella and deciding, looking at a map, that there's a line he's going to draw arbitrarily. And everything on this side of the line Spain gets, everything on this side of the line Portugal gets. On the top of page 65, he's talking about the people that live in these places that he's about to divide up and hand to colonial powers. Moreover, as your aforesaid envoys are of opinion, these very peoples living in the said islands and countries believe in one God, the Creator in heaven, and seem sufficiently disposed to embrace the Catholic faith and be trained in good morals. And it is hoped that were they instructed, the name of the Savior, our Lord Jesus Christ, would easily be introduced into the said countries and islands. So it has on its surface this benign spreading of the faith, but we know about history that oftentimes the benign spreading of the faith was simply the point of the spear. And so that second to the bottom paragraph on page 65, he continues out of his merciful bounty. Oh, before I do that, at the top of that paragraph, he's talking about the name of the Savior, our Lord Jesus Christ, easily be introduced in the hearts in the said countries and islands. At the end of that paragraph, he says, kind of an, oh, by the way, in the islands and countries already discovered are found gold, spices, and very many other precious things of diverse kinds and qualities. We'll grab those while we're there. Second to bottom paragraph. We of our own accord, a couple lines into the paragraph, not at your instance, nor the request of anyone else in your regard, but out of our own sole largesse and certain knowledge, and out of the fullness of our apostolic power by the authority of Almighty God, conferred upon us in Blessed Peter and the vicarship of Jesus Christ, which we hold on earth. And you want to say, come on, get on with it, right? And I want you to think about this language because Kai's going to take us through something which almost has the exact same language, but which is not from the head of a church. Give, grant, and assign to you and your heirs and successors, kings of Castile and Leon, forever, together with all their dominions, cities, camps, places, and villages, and all rights, jurisdictions, and appurtenances, all islands and mainlands found and to be found, discovered and to be discovered towards the west and south, by drawing and establishing a line from the Arctic pole, namely the north, to the Antarctic pole, namely the south, no matter whether the said islands and mainlands are found and to be found in the direction of India or towards any other quarter, the said line to be distant 100 leagues toward the west and south from any of the islands commonly known as Azores and Cape Verde. Here's the line, here's what you get, here's what you get. Now,
Church is saying this?
this is the head of the Catholic Church. On page 66,
What year was that?
1493. Again, he's talking about the spreading of the faith in that second paragraph on page 66. Employing all due diligence in the premises, as you also promise, you should appoint to the aforesaid mainlands and islands worthy, God-fearing, learned, skilled, and experienced men in order to instruct the aforesaid habitants and residents in the Catholic faith and train them in good morals. Now he brings the muscle at the bottom in that final paragraph, in the last 6 lines. Let no one, therefore, infringe or with rash boldness contravene this our recommendation, exhortation, requisition, gift, grant, assignment, constitution, deputation, decree, mandate, prohibition, and will. Should anyone attempt to attempt this, be it known to him that he will incur the wrath of Almighty God and of the blessed apostles Peter and Paul. So we know this is our colonialist history, right? But just think about the image of this white man in Rome deciding places he'd never been and who gets to control, who gets to decide. Back to what Kai said about this is about decision-making authority and how it was systematically stripped from place after place after place around the globe under the mantle of colonial expansion, headed by the church in the papal bull, replicated on page 67 in the charter to, you want to do that next?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay. To William Penn from King Charles II, 1681. So almost 200 years later. But you'll hear echoes of the exact same language.
I think one of the interesting things that, in that case, it was literally just someone drawing a line on a map. I mean, they just made it so. I mean, obviously they have to back it up with force, but there became the understanding that they had to legalize it, in essence, put it into words to then justify the actions.
I suppose the Roman Catholic Church was considered kind of the closest thing to an international authority because of its reach, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so this process basically of those who had power inventing then the realities for others to live under is, again, not new. In this case, the papal bull reflecting that. We didn't cover the piece earlier, but William the Conqueror, in the House of Lords, for instance, the origin of the House of Lords was they were basically just soldiers for William the Conqueror who he gave land to that weren't his to begin with. So he basically stole land and gave it to his soldiers, and then they became lords. So they have these very high, lofty names, but the origin is that they were basically thieves that just stole and, basically raped and pillaged, but then now, have assured themselves that they have this authority to make law and to rule. Just as in this case, the Pope saying, I have now the law to split the globe up, and I'm going to give half to Spain and half to Portugal. And this has significance because it becomes localized in a sense through something like the Penn Charter that we'll get to in a second. Earl, you had a question?
Well, as memory serves, that line went right down through Brazil, and that's why Brazil speaks Portuguese and the rest of Latin America speaks Spanish.
As one of the other, democracy school lecturers, when we start talking about law, because it can get really sort of dry and whatnot, it said something really good, which is, it's words on paper. Literally what it comes down to. We know that there's force that's put behind those words quite often, but it often starts out with just words on paper. So in this case, it was the Pope who put words on paper that just made it so. And of course, then we saw the great colonizing powers do what they did with it, but it started with someone saying, we have the authority, in this case, the Pope from God himself, saying you have this authority now to split the globe up and divide it up as you please between these two large colonizing powers. And that those words of that papal bull get replicated then. So when we talk about in section B, we talk about the spreading of English common law. Part of it was then to put it into the law itself. So the section B heading here is about colonization, and again replicating the English structure of law. So it wasn't just about the wealth and all the horrific destruction that went with it. It was also about making sure that the system of law itself spread globally as well. So on page 67, you have a copy of what is the Penn Charter. This was really the deed, in essence, the land deed given by the king to William Penn. It was a debt owed to his father, who had passed away at that point. And so the king was making due on his debt, and so he gave what eventually became now Pennsylvania this charter. And so there was this legal document that went with the bestowing of the land that, of course, wasn't his to begin with, but they made it so. And so they put it down in writing as well and defined what it actually meant. So when you turn to page 68, you start to see the echoing from 200 years previously, because now we're in the 1600s here, 1681. We're about 200 years after that papal bull, but that same voice of the Pope is still ringing true. So on page 68, it begins here, Charles II, by the grace of God, King of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, and to all in these presents shall come greeting, whereas our trustee and well-beloved subject, William Penn, Esquire, son of heir of Sir William Penn, deceased and out of commendable desire to enlarge our English empire, and promote such useful commodities as may be of benefit to us in our dominions, as also to reduce the savage natives by gentle and just manners to the love of civil society and Christian religion. So the ordering was a little bit different than the Pope's, but it was the same sort of mandate, that we were going to spread the Christian faith, but at the same time we were also going to enlarge the empire and build our economic wealth at the same time, and that this was really going to be an instrument of that bestowed on a single person, in this case William Penn.
And the context for this is that King Charles and Sir William Penn, the father of William Penn, Esquire, who gets this charter, were essentially like old fraternity brothers. And Charles owed Sir William Penn a debt. And so he hands to his son this charter, giving him title to all of the stuff that we're about to hear.
So on page 69, right-hand column, midway downward, it says section 2 in bold. This goes back to what Brad had sort of pointed out earlier about some of the language again. It reads here, we do also give and grant unto the said William Penn, his heirs and assignees, the free and undisturbed use and continuance in and passage into and out of all the singular ports, harbors, bays, waters, rivers, isles, and inlets, belonging unto or leading to, and from the country to islands aforesaid, and all of soil, lands, fields, woods, underwoods, mountains, hills, fens, isles, lakes, rivers, waters, rivulets, bays, and inlets, situated or being within or belonging unto the limits and bounds aforesaid, together with all fishing of all sorts of fish, whales, sturgeons, and all other royal and other fishes in the sea, bays, inlets, waters, or rivers within the premises, and the fish therein taken, and also the veins, mines, and quarries, as well discovered as not discovered, of gold, silver, gems, and precious stones, and all other whatsoever, stones, metals, and other things, or matters whatsoever found or to be found within country, isles, or limits aforesaid.
It makes you wonder why they didn't just stop after one or two and then say all whatsoever.
All of creation.
Everything.
Yeah.
So if you continue on page 70 down to the last, or that left-hand column towards the bottom, the last few lines, it describes sort of the power of the systems of governments. They say, we do hereby erect the aforesaid country and islands into a province, a seigneury, and do it, call it Pennsylvania. So that's the determining that it's going to be called Pennsylvania. Same page, right-hand column, midway down. It's about 15 lines from the top. This is about who's going to be in control. It says to ordain, make, and act under his and their seals to publish any laws whatsoever. So this idea that a single person basically is going to control this massive land, and anything that's needed for him to execute that operation of that land, he has the power to do so. So he's really the sole authority of what becomes eventually Pennsylvania.
Wait, I'm sorry, Kai, so it's
Yep.
probably obvious, but the authority to do all this is just presumed to have come from God or from the king, or and people are just
Yes.
Yes.
accepted that?
Because the
Exactly.
king got his power from God.
Yeah.
So that was just an acceptable form of authority, that people just kowtowed to that, just did?
Yeah, so that whole, when Jalen Smith talks about the Magna Carta, for instance, you had this power play of the very wealthy against the king himself. And they were then saying, well, we don't just want to be under the king's rule, we want some power. And so they associated this relationship between the king and what became eventually the House of Lords. And this is really sort of an extension of that, saying, well, those who have can then dole out to those who have as well, regardless of those who may be in existence, but not recognized in the sense of the power structure, but even in the laws themselves. So like the Magna Carta didn't recognize the rights of the vast majority of people. And in this case, the king, because he was the king, got the power from God himself, can then carve up land on the new continent and then just hand it over to individuals like William Penn, because he had the authority to do so. And as I mentioned, he just put it down in writing and made it so. And of course, he had the British Army and everything to back it up with, but that's basically the power transfer.
The people who were living there notwithstanding.
Yep. Whether there were other people who had migrated there, or of course the
Were there
indigenous
some?
people.
Yeah.
Yeah, regardless. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second here when we get to talking about the doctrine of discovery. So there's a legal doctrine that talks about that, which really comes from the papal bull itself, which is black letter law in the United States today. That the doctrine of discovery is still being upheld against natives people in their claims for land. That the doctrine of discovery that we'll get to here in a little bit basically was like this charter. It said, well, if you were of that certain class and had certain power, you can just claim something as yours, regardless of who may have been there, and that you would then own that particular piece of property. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in the doctrine of discovery, but it's really the extension of the papal bull just as much as the Penn Charter is an extension of the papal bull, both in what it says, but also how it functions, and who is actually benefiting from it, and who is actually being ignored or being really persecuted because of the way that the system of law and governance was operated.
And here's a thread to tie those together, the papal bull and the Penn Charter, from W.E.B. Du Bois, which is in a piece that we'll get to in a minute. Du Bois says the reason for this world mastery by Europe was rationalized as the natural and inborn superiority of white people.
So page 71, just to finish up the Penn Charter, left-hand column towards the bottom, where we talk about the notion that part of what the empire wanted to do was to make sure that they replicated the system itself, the system of law, the system of governance. So it's actually written here as to how it needs to operate. So if you go up from the bottom of that left-hand column about 8 lines, it says, provided nevertheless that the said laws be consonant to reason and not be repugnant to or contrary, but as near as convenient may be agreeable to the laws, statutes, and the rights of this our kingdom of England. So that was really the statement about replicating English common law, that to make sure that within this charter that it wasn't about putting your new system in place, it was about making sure you kept the same English common law system in place through how you ever operate in your control of Pennsylvania at this point. And then on page 73, just to finish up, to make it very clear also about that it wasn't just about cutting William Penn loose to do what he wanted, but to make sure that it was about expanding the British Empire. The right-hand column, about 8 lines or 10 lines down from the top, where it says, all merchandises and goods whatsoever that all arise of the fruits and commodities of the said province, either by land or sea, into any of the ports of us, our heirs and successors, in our kingdom of England, and not into any other country whatsoever. So this idea that England would be the sole trading partner, basically, that everything would have to funnel back through the British Empire, that you wouldn't be allowed to trade with anybody else. So that was a restriction on that particular charter issued by the king. We're going to switch back quickly to the start of section B. Brad mentioned the piece on page 47 called The World in Africa by W.E. Du Bois. We've got two pieces in there, one on sort of what happened in Africa, and then one more specifically on the Caribbean, but sort of what became the operationalization of the papal bull, meaning these colonizing empires went out and they basically did what the papal bull authorized them to do, which was to colonize. And as Brad mentioned, they used the rationalization to do so around racist tendencies, true racism, to say that we are superior, therefore we're going to bring you savage people under control. We're going to bring you under the hall of Christianity because that is our our calling, and of course at the same time we're going to increase our power and our riches in the process. And if we can do it gently, great. If not, we will use violent means to overthrow you and to bring you under the cultural control of Christianity at that time. So Du Bois in this piece really starts to pull that apart and remind us of what that actually looked like. That piece really talks more specifically about kind of this rationalization and all the various things that they had to do to convince themselves that what they were doing was just and moral and within the Christian faith. And of course a lot of that had to do with legalizing it, so writing the laws to reflect their actions, because that was the easiest way that they figured things can move, is if you made it the law. So on page 53, just to point out one more thing around Du Bois and his pointing out sort of the rationalization of the colonizing empires. If you turn the book on its side so you can read it, on that right-hand column, top of the page there, he writes, perhaps the worst thing about the colonial system was the contradiction which it arose and had to arise in Europe with regard to the whole situation. Extreme poverty in the colonies was a main cause of wealth and luxury in Europe. The results of this poverty were disease, ignorance, and crime, yet these had to be represented as natural characteristics of backward peoples. If you skip down to that next paragraph, about the fourth line in that next paragraph, he goes on to say, to prove the unfitness of most human beings for self-rule and self-expression, every device of science was used. Evolution was made to prove that Negroes and Asiatics were less developed human beings than whites. History is so written as to make all civilizations the development of white people. Economics was so taught as to make all wealth due mainly to the technical accomplishments of white folks, supplemented only by brute toil of colored people. Brain weights and intelligence tests were used and distorted to prove superiority of white folk. The result was complete domination of the world by Europe and North America, and a culmination of tempo of civilization singularly satisfactory to the majority of writers and thinkers, so on. So Du Bois explaining, the various ways of which the system had to define itself and confirm itself, and again, law was a big way of which the system did that. We're going to skip over the next piece called The Black Diaspora, but if you want to read that, it talks about the slavery trade in the Caribbean. One element that I found interesting in preparing for the Democracy School was there's a section on page 59, if you want to look at that quickly. So on page 59, if you turn the book, right-hand column at the bottom, it's talking about all the various slave revolts happening, because slavery got to the point in the Caribbean that the slave population was far outnumbering the population of those who were in control, so the white colonizers themselves. So they had to find ways to make sure that the black population didn't, of course, get out of control. And of course, one way they did that was through lawmaking, but also then through the lawmaking legalizing the violence that they then can inflict upon the slaves that they tried to revolt. So in a lot of those cases where the ratio was such that it was clear that they were outnumbered, the laws themselves became much more brutal in what they posed. So on the bottom of page 59, right-hand column, that last paragraph, it says the codes came to contain so many offenses which slaves could commit that the law seemed bent on exhausting every possibility of intimidating or punishing disobedience in the cause of saving the proprietor from his own property. And not to parallel the time of slavery and the amount of violence and horrific conditions that the people lived under at that time, but just to give a kind of a modern parallel, looking at people who are now trying to stand their ground in front of the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. You're starting to see state legislatures trying to impose very harsh penalties against those who want to actually defy the building of pipelines or drill wells or whatever it may be. such that in places like North Dakota, they're trying to make it a law, or they may have passed it, that if you accidentally hit somebody who's blocking a road, well, that you would not be found liable for doing so if protesters were blocking the road. Or there's a recent law that just got passed, I think in Arizona, where they're talking about being able to file racketeering charges against protesters. So that if protesters come together, they're trying to use the laws instituted to fight organized crime to actually be imposed upon people protesting whatever they may be protesting, whether it's civil rights or environmental rights or worker rights. So basically to criminalize the activity and obviously to chill the effect of the people to rise up against an unjust system. So again, different era, different time, but just to show that when the system is threatened, the system will come down not only through force, but actually use the power of writing law to make that so. And so that's an example of how the colonizing powers, the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese, did it during their time.
And one more example from the I don't know if it's Seagal or Siegel piece, and I won't make you find it because I know we want to wrap up tonight. There's a reference here in a paragraph about the slave trade in Barbados, where he says, it's on page 57 if you want to find it in the right-hand column. He says, according to blacks who lived there, Barbados became, it's the second to last paragraph in the right-hand column, became a more dreadful apprehension than we can have of hell, and the slave population decreased by 6.7% a year from 1645 to 1672, 5% a year from 1684 to 1756. It was, the planters calculated, cheaper to lose slaves from overwork, poor diet, or other ill treatment and replace them with new ones than to keep more of them alive by more humane methods. The engine requires the sacrifice at constant, increasingly rapacious rates. And so, I mean, you can feel the echoes of this from the 1600s into now, this consolidation of authoritarian principles, and it will grind up whoever it needs on the way, regardless of, and as Kai said, the examples in North Dakota and Arizona of lawmakers participating with the grinding of the machine. And perhaps they're aware and perhaps they're not, but the machine grinds on.
We got a couple more pieces before we're done. So on page 77, so skipping ahead now to 77, there's a book titled The American Indian in Western Legal Thought. And this is a couple opening pages. Actually, it's a couple pages from the conclusion of the book. And it talks about this doctrine of discovery. So the basic premise of the doctrine of discovery is if you were white, colonizing nation, and you landed somewhere which some other white colonizing nation hadn't yet from Europe, well, you could claim that land is yours. And it's basically what the colonizing empires did around the globe.
You said page 77?
Page 77. We're talking about the doctrine of discovery, but the title of that piece is called The American Indian in Western Legal Thought. And that doctrine of discovery still functions today as law. And in fact, if you dig into the topic, you'll find that a lot of indigenous groups are trying to lobby the UN, for instance, and other bodies out there to basically unrecognize this instrument of brutality, because it was really the main driver of all the genocidal activities of the colonizing empires, was to use this doctrine of discovery notion to, again, claim something that wasn't yours. And again, this is a legal doctrine still enforced today in our U.S. system of law. So this stuff isn't just about 1492 or 1681. It's still very much about 2017 as far as how a lot of our systems and doctrines of law function, because there's a reason for that, because it all comes out of this English common structure of law, English common law. So just to point out a couple of things and to kind of reinforce the mentality of how the law operated, again, within culture and how systems work and who had power and who didn't. If you turn to page 78, the author writes here at the top, "The conquest of the earth is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. The history of the American Indian and Western legal thought reveals that a will to empire proceeds most effectively under a rule of law. In the United States and in other Western settled or colonized states, the rule begins with the doctrine of discovery and its discourse of conquest, which denies fundamental human rights and self-determination to indigenous tribal peoples. For the native peoples of the United States, Latin America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, therefore, the end of history of their colonization begins by the denying the legitimacy of and respect for the rule of law maintained by the racist discourse of conquest of the doctrine of discovery. And then skipping over to page 79, that first full paragraph. For half a millennium, whether inscribed in United States Indian law and its central doctrine of discovery, in the Spanish Juris Victoria's Law of Nations, or in the Lord Coke's English common law, Western legal thought has sought to erase the difference presented by the American Indian in order to sustain the privileges of power it accords to Western norms and value structures. So a lot of really what Democracy School about is really more about culture and about ordering of how systems are going to work in government. And even though we don't talk about it in that context, in a lot of ways that's exactly what was happening by the colonizing empires. They were writing law then to define or rationalize their actions and basically to justify their cultures in a lot of ways at the expense, of course, of a vast majority of other people who didn't fit within that worldview. And so using law was a major weapon, not just the weapons themselves. And then skipping down to the next paragraph, reading a couple things in that paragraph there. The doctrine of discovery was nothing more than a reflection, a set of geocentric racist beliefs elevated to the status of a universal principle. One culture's argument to support its conquest and colonization of a newly discovered alien world. So the whole idea of, savage nations or the brutal people or, the backward people or however they framed it, they had to tell themselves that to make it easier to do the killing and the pillaging and the destruction. Otherwise, they may have never done what they did if they would have thought otherwise. So they had to again justify it to themselves. And then finishing off that paragraph, skipping a couple lines, it says Europe during the discovery era refused to recognize any meaningful legal status or rights for indigenous tribal peoples because heathens and infidels were legally presumed to lack the rational capacity necessary to assume an equal status or to exercise equal rights under the West's medievally derived colonizing law. And we're going to hear not only about indigenous First Peoples nations, but also women, for instance. The same kind of mentality was applied to women up until fairly recently. And so it wasn't just the colonizing of, again, native people or indigenous people where they're at, but also other people within society were not recognized basically as people. And in fact, from a legal perspective, in most cases, they were not just not people, they were property under the law. So slaves were property under the law, women were property under the law. And we'll get into more about this property distinction of rights and how the system looked at it versus how we may look at it today. But there was very much a time when people were not people under the system, but actually property. And how that English common law, again, perpetuated that kind of worldview when it came to who had control and who didn't, who would govern and who wouldn't govern. So the last piece that we want to get to is starting on page 83. And this brings in another element into the conversation. We've been talking about people, but this next piece really talks about nature itself and sort of what was the view during this period of time that this piece talks about, but even in a lot of ways, what the view of nature is today. So just something to stick in your head. Under the law today, nature is property. Okay? Nature has no rights under our legal system. It is seen as property. So you can see how even our system of law operates today, how it harkens back even to these views from 200-300 years ago in the sense of man's position to nature and man's role when it comes to nature and how we deal with our basically our disassociation to nature versus really the fact that we're part of nature.
So this is a short excerpt from a book called Traces on the Rhodian Shore, Nature and Culture in Western Thought by Clarence Glacken. This excerpt focuses on a man named Sir Matthew Hale. And so it brings us back to King Charles II, he of the Penn Charter. So Matthew Hale was a lawyer. Under King Charles II, he was the Chief Justice of the King's Bench. So he's the head judge, he's the Chief Justice of their Supreme Court. He was widely revered as an expert on British common law. So we end tonight kind of where we started, about this bathing, this basting, the replication of English common law, and Hale was one of its most eloquent spokespeople. He wrote a book called The History of the Pleas of the Crown. He wrote a book called The Primitive Origination of Mankind. Quick side note about the beautiful character of our friend Matthew Hale. He, as a legal opinion, said marital rape was an impossibility, since, quote, the wife hath given herself up in this kind unto her husband, which she cannot retract, unquote. So he clearly viewed women as property. This excerpt highlights how he viewed nature as property as well. And so on page 84, in that middle paragraph that starts with, in the primitive origination of mankind, one of the books he wrote, there's a reference in the middle that says, to Hale, man acts as the steward of God on earth. Man is a being who creates order in what without him would be chaos. I grew up in a very sort of orthodox Christian faith, and I was taught that God wanted me and all good disciples to be stewards of the earth and take care of creation. So on the surface that seems fine. You go down to the next paragraph, it says, in an exciting and imaginative discussion, Hale says that man's place in nature can be known from observation without revelation. And here's the key passage. The creation of man seems to have an end or purpose with relation to the order of nature on earth. The wild, untamable animals need man's coercive power to prevent their destroying the more profitable and weaker animals. Skip down about 5 lines. Glacken goes on to say, his is a superintendent industry, correcting their excesses, lest the spontaneous plant production make of the earth a wilderness of trees, weeds, thorns, briars. Over on page 85, in that last paragraph underneath the excerpt from his book, about 6 lines up from the bottom, the earth is in need of a superior creature to keep it in competent order. Otherwise, the balance in nature would be lost. Forest and wilderness would engulf both the earth and man. The useful animals, the prey of savage beasts, would be on the road to extinction. He controls nature for the earth's sake and for his own. At the very top of page 86, and while I grew up with this, be a steward, take care of nature, be a good caretaker, I was also sort of bathed in the mythology that there's a superiority of human beings. That first full paragraph, to Hale, and many 17th and 18th century thinkers agreed, man's control over nature is based on his position in the scale of being. He enjoys the topmost rung of the ladder, but he is a master whose rights are circumscribed by obligations, by noblesse oblige. Man's position is a legal one. He is an overseer of nature, like a husbandman with the earth as his farm, whose activity, this is key, this is where the Constitution takes us, whose activities Hale describes in the language of law and commerce. To wrap up for tonight, there's a short excerpt on page 87 and 88 by a man named Professor Laxman D. Satya about the extension of British Empire and common law into India. And he writes about centuries-old traditions and regions in India where communities learn to live in balance with nature, following its rhythms, harvest, slash and burn forestry according to what they sensed the land needed. He says, others have observed that the South Asian society had always been shaped and reshaped by a close interaction between pastoral nomads, agriculturists, and forest dwellers. Sumit Guha, in his recent book, has further elaborated his observation by stating that the boundary between the 3 environmental regions, that is, forests, grazing grounds, cultivated fields, had always been fluid before the advent of British rule. The British arrived, British common law, British commerce, the extension of the empire. However, this fluidity and flexibility threatened the colonial state's greed for revenues and desire for territorial expansion. Skip down below the break, and he goes on to say, This meant that the grazing lands and common grounds virtually disappeared under the onslaught of colonial commercialization. The official term for designating these such areas was wastelands. For the British, this meant lands that did not generate revenues, hence uneconomic, and therefore the need to make it productive and economic by putting it under the plow. But for people in the villages, these lands were a part of their daily life and survival in times of calamities such as famine and drought. He goes on to talk about the ramifications and the devastation that caused in these rural communities. At the end of page 88, about 6 lines up from the bottom, he says the forest dwellers were gradually pushed out of their natural habitat, and slash and burn agriculture was prohibited. The forests were taken over and declared government reserves in order to serve the needs of imperial railways, there's the railroads again, and the military. The commercialization of forest resources such as wood, leaf, manure, grass, fodder, wild grains, etc., removed the drought and famine cushion on which the people had traditionally relied in times of crisis. And one more story just to give you an idea of the extension of the British Empire and their brutality. Many of you may know the reliance that traditional Indian society had on weaving and the production of cloth, and you know about Gandhi's civil disobedience and creating homespun. When the British took over India, knowing that part of their control had to be exerting economic power, and that, like in the Penn Charter, all resources, all profits get funneled back to England, so that Indian citizens would rely on British textiles as a way to thwart the traditions, the centuries-old traditions of weaving, to force Indians to buy in British textiles. They cut off the thumbs of the master weavers. So they could not teach weaving to their apprentices and pass it down. That kind of illustrates that this extension of British common law around the globe, not just British, but in colonization, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Belgians, was always followed by or preceded by this massive brutality, which in Du Bois's words was simply a result of this traditional belief that anybody who was not white was inferior. This is the end of tonight. And so if you're pissed off and depressed now, I'll just tell you it gets worse tomorrow.
I have actually an academic.
Jim.
Are you saying that this Hale and his writings, his interpretations, is that sort of when property became the I don't know what you say, the currency of citizenship and inalienable rights? Is that?
I'm not sure if it's a direct causal link, but Hale's defense of nature as property has echoes now, that whatever piece of property you own under current U.S. legal structures handed down from British common law means if you own a plot of land, X number of acres, you possess the legal right to destroy it.
Well, you also are getting at other rights, like the right to vote, all these other that came from that were only given to property owners. Was that kind of where that started? That property.
I think it predates Hale, because Hale's 1600s, and I think it predates him.
Oh, okay. So,
Just real quick, we like to end Friday night with a quick check-in, people's thoughts, questions, comments, how are you feeling?
really depressed.
It's all stuff I know already, but it's interesting to see it, where it came from and how it developed, and some of that I was familiar with, but just to the extent of.
Yeah, one of the values I like about this curriculum is you get to hear it in the people's words at the time, and it's not, we have the benefit of time and distance, but if they're saying it then, that's the frightening part about how it echoes to 2017 and what we're currently living through, right?